The one-drop rule was a legal principle of racial classification prominent in the 20th century United States. It asserted that any person with even one ancestor of black ancestry, one drop of black blood, is considered black, Negro, or colored in historical terms. It is an example of hypodescent, the automatic assignment of children of a mixed union between different socioeconomic or ethnic groups to the group with the lower status, regardless of the proportion of ancestry in various groups. This concept became codified into the law of some U.S. states in the early 20th century. It was associated with the principle of invisible blackness that developed after the long history of racial interaction in the South, which included the hardening of slavery as a racial caste system and later segregation. Before the Supreme Court outlawed the rule in the Loving v. Virginia decision of 1967, it was used to prevent interracial marriages and, in general, to deny rights and equal opportunities and uphold white supremacy. Before the American Civil War, free individuals of mixed race, free people of color, were considered legally white if they had less than either 1/8 or 1/4 African ancestry, only in Virginia. Many mixed-race people were absorbed into the majority culture based simply on appearance, associations, and carrying out community responsibilities. These and community acceptance were the more important factors if a person's racial status were questioned, not their documented ancestry. Based on late 20th century DNA analysis and a preponderance of historical evidence, U.S. President Thomas Jefferson is widely believed to have fathered the 6 mixed-race children with his slave Sally Hemings, who was herself 3/4 white and a paternal half-sister of his wife, Martha Wayles Jefferson. 4 of them survived to adulthood. Under Virginia law of the time, while their 7/8 European ancestry would have made them legally white if they'd been free, being born to an enslaved mother made them automatically enslaved from birth. Jefferson allowed the 2 oldest to escape in 1822. Freeing them legally was a public action he elected to avoid because he would have had to gain permission from the state legislature. The 2 youngest he freed in his 1826 will. 3 of the 4 entered white society as adults. Subsequently, their descendants identified as white. Although racial segregation was adopted legally by southern states of the former Confederacy in the late 19th century, legislators resisted defining race by law as part of preventing interracial marriages. The one-drop rule was not formally codified as law until the 20th century, from 1910 in Tennessee to 1930 as one of Virginia's racial integrity laws, with similar laws in several other states in between. In the early colonial years, children born of one indigenous and one non-native parent usually had a white father and an indigenous mother. This was primarily due to the majority of the early colonists being male. As many Native American tribes had matrilineal kinship systems, they considered the children to be born to the mother's family and clan. If they were raised in the culture, they were regarded as members of the community and therefore fully Native American. Before colonization, and still in traditional communities, the idea of determining belonging by degree of blood was and is unheard of. Native American tribes did not use blood quantum law until the U.S. government introduced the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, instead determining tribal status based on kinship, lineage, and family ties. However, many land cession treaties, particularly during Indian removal in the 19th century, contained provisions for mixed-blood descendants of European and Native ancestry to receive either parcels of land ceded in the treaty or a share in a lump sum of money, with specifications as to the degree of tribal ancestry required to qualify. Though these did not typically apply a one-drop rule, determining the ancestry of individual claimants was not straightforward, and the process was often rife with fraud. Among patrilineal tribes, such as the Omaha, historically, A child born to an Omaha mother and a white father could belong officially to the Omaha tribe only if the child were formally adopted into it by a male citizen. In contemporary practice, tribal laws around citizenship and parentage can vary widely between nations. Between 1904 and 1919, tribal members with any amount of African ancestry were disenrolled from the Chitimacha tribe of Louisiana, and their descendants have since then been denied tribal membership. In 20th century America, the concept of the one-drop rule has been primarily applied by white Americans to those of sub-Saharan black African ancestry when some whites were trying to maintain some degree of overt or covert white supremacy. This rule meant many mixed-race people of diverse ancestry were seen as African American, and their more varied ancestors were forgotten and erased, making it challenging to trace ancestry in the present day accurately. Many descendants of those who were enslaved and trafficked by Europeans and Americans have assumed they have Native American ancestry. Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s 2006 PBS documentary on the genetic makeup of African Americans, African American Lives, focused on these stories of Native American heritage in African American communities. DNA test results showed, after African, primarily European ancestors, for all but 2 celebrities interviewed. However, many critics point to the limitations of DNA testing for ancestry, especially for minority populations. During World War II, Colonel Carl Benditson stated that anyone with 1 drop of Japanese blood was liable for forced internment in camps today. There are no enforceable laws in the U.S. in which the one-drop rule is applicable. Sociologically, however, while the concept has in recent years become less acceptable within the black community, with more people identifying as biracial, research has found that in white society, it is still expected to associate biracial children primarily with the individual's non-white ancestry. Both before and after the American Civil War, many people of mixed ancestry who looked white and were of primarily white ancestry were legally absorbed into the white majority. State laws established differing standards. For instance, an 1822 Virginia law stated that to be defined as mulatto, that is, multiracial, a person had to have at least 1/4, equivalent to 1 grandparent, African ancestry. Social acceptance and identity were historically the keys to racial identity. Virginia's 1/4 standard remained in place until 190s, when the standard was changed to 1/16. In 1930, even the 1/16th standard was abandoned in favor of a more stringent standard. The act defined a person as legally colored, black, for classification and legal purposes if the individual had any African ancestry. Although the Virginia legislature increased restrictions on free blacks following Nat Turner's Rebellion of 1831, it refrained from establishing a one-drop rule. When a proposal was made by Travis H. Epps and debated in 1853, representatives realized that such a rule could adversely affect whites, as they were aware of generations of interracial relationships. The 1924 Virginia law, in such a way that vital records were changed or destroyed, family members were split on opposite sides of the color line, and there were losses of the documented continuity of people who identified as American Indian, as all people in Virginia had to be classified as white or black. Over the centuries, many Indian tribes in Virginia had absorbed people of other ethnicities through marriage or adoption but maintained their cultures. Suspecting blacks of trying to pass as Indians, Plecker ordered records changed to classify people only as black or white, and ordered offices to reclassify specific family surnames from Indian to black. Since the late 20th century, Virginia has officially recognized 8 American Indian tribes and their members. The tribes are trying to gain federal recognition. They have had difficulty because decades of birth, marriage, and death records were misclassified under Plecker's application of the law. No one was classified as Indian, although many individuals and families identified that way and were preserving their cultures. In the case of mixed-race American, Indian, and European descendants, the one-drop rule in Virginia was extended only so far as those with more than 1/16th Indian blood. This was due to what was known as the Pocahontas exception, since many influential first families of Virginia, FFV, claimed descent from the American Indian Pocahontas and her husband John Rolfe of the colonial era. The Virginia General Assembly declared that an individual could be considered white if having no more than 1/16th Indian blood, the equivalent of one great-great-grandparent. People in many other countries have tended to treat race less rigidly, both in their self-identification and how they regard others. Just as a person with physically recognizable African ancestry can claim to be black in the United States, someone with recognizable European ancestry may be considered white in Brazil, even if they are mixed race. During the Spanish colonial period, Puerto Rico had laws such as the Regla del Sacar, or Gracias al Sacar, by which a person of black ancestry could be considered legally white so long as the individual could prove that at least one person per generation in the last 4 generations had also been legally white. Thus, persons of some black ancestry with known white lineage were classified as white, the opposite of the one-drop rule in the United States. Charles W. Chestnut, who was of mixed race and grew up in the North, wrote stories and novels about the issues of mixed-race people in Southern society in the aftermath of the Civil War. The one-drop rule and its consequences have been the subject of numerous works of popular culture. The American musical show Boat, 1927, opens in 1887 on a Mississippi riverboat after the Reconstruction era and the imposition of racial segregation and Jim Crow in the South. Steve, a white man married to a mixed-race woman who passes as white, is pursued by a Southern sheriff. He intends to arrest Steve and charge him with miscegenation for being married to a woman of partly black ancestry. Steve pricks his wife's finger and swallows some of her blood. When the sheriff arrives, Steve asks him whether he would consider a man to be white if he had Negro blood in him. The sheriff replies that one drop of Negro blood makes you a Negro in these parts. Steve tells the sheriff that he has more than a drop of Negro blood in me. After being assured by others that Steve is telling the truth, the sheriff leaves without arresting Steve. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more content.